Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time for some more Storycraft. What I'd like to talk to you about today is two concepts that contrast with one another: architects versus gardeners, otherwise known as their synonyms, plotters versus pantsers, depending on which sort of literary circles or blogs you're reading. I'm going to talk a lot about novelists, by the way, in this video, and that's not because this is specifically for novelists. In fact, I think awareness of these terms would be useful for anybody that's working in any medium where you're creating a story. So if you are a graphic novelist, I think it's important to know about these. And if you're creating a video game that has a story, I think it's important to think about these particular terms. In fact, I think video game stories could benefit from more thought about means of telling stories like this. So these two terms, gardener versus architect, in this context were really popularized by fantasy writer George R.R. Martin, who I'm sure you know of. And if you don't know of him, then you probably know of the TV series based on his book. That's the HBO series Game of Thrones. It's based on the entire series of books, actually, which is called Song of Ice and Fire, but the name of the series is named after the first book, A Game of Thrones. He has talked about these two particular concepts and how they relate to one another. And I'm going to link it down below an interview he did with The Guardian a while back that I think is informative. And he uses and defines these terms in the way that I'm going to talk about. And it's also just good to read interviews like this because you kind of get a little bit more understanding of what a successful writer is doing and thinking about his particular craft. And George R.R. Martin does do a lot of thought about his craft. So an architect versus a gardener. An architect, the way Martin really describes it, is like somebody who approaches making a book or making a story the way that you would build a house, which is you design everything before you begin building the house. You know how big the house is going to be, where it's going to sit on the lot, what composition the materials are going to be made of. You may know, you're going to know how many rooms there are, where the rooms are, where the doors are, everything down to like the little details that are necessary to begin building the house. And then once you have planned that out, you begin the house. So in a story, you would come up with all the necessary details to write the story. You would know all the characters ahead of time and have them predefined and even define their growth arcs. You would know the setting, and you would have written down the setting or made sure that the setting is well planned. And most importantly, you would know the sequence of events in the story, the plot, and you would have that completely planned out down to like, if you were going full bore this style, some people actually plan down to the scene level and to like the sub-scene level before they ever begin putting a word on the page. You contrast that with a gardener. He describes a gardener as like you plant a seed and you see what grows. And so like a gardener tending a plant, you know what seed you put in the ground. Like if I put a fantasy seed here, and I have an idea of what plant is going to come out of that, but you don't know how many branches it's going to have. You don't know what direction the branches are going to go in, or how exactly the leaves are going to look. You just know what you planted. So a gardener tending a plant, maybe he's trimming the hedges or something like that. He's tending something that he doesn't have full control over. The plant grows as it will, and the gardener kind of helps its growth and encourages its growth and makes sure that it's overall like the proper shape. So a gardener, there's an element of spontaneity and uncertainty with gardening, whereas an architect, it's completely certain before you begin. Now the next question is, which of these two styles should I write in? Should I write in the plotter style, the architect style, or the pantser style, the gardener style? And by the way, some people say pantsers, the people who write by the seat of their pants. I like gardener better because pantser kind of seems like you're just flinging words on the page and hoping they come out well, and that may not be what a gardener does at all. Gardener may write very slowly and carefully, but just not be thinking in terms of what each individual sentence is doing in terms of his overall plan. He may not have a plan for an end goal. He may be kind of seeing where it's going. And you can do that carefully or swiftly, but kind of writing by the seat of your pants and kind of to me implies something fast. So which of these two should you do? Well, I would say, first of all, it's a continuum and you don't have to be either one. And second of all, it really depends on you and what's going to work for you and who you are as an artist. And I recommend understanding both of these ideas and trying to incorporate elements from both, and especially if you're sort of beginning to form your style, and you'll figure out a really good process through the process of writing, through attempting a couple of different things. So I mentioned it's like a continuum. George R.R. Martin himself says, I'm more of a gardener than I am a architect, or more of a gardener than I am an architect, which means that some things are planned out. You have an idea of some things that are going to happen, but you haven't figured out all the details, and you sort of write the details as they come. And so you garden that in a sense. And in that sense, it would be like, you know that you're trying to grow a topiary into a certain shape, but you don't know like how the branches are going to fit together. You don't know all the little details. You know the overall thing. That might be what he's doing. And certainly there's a lot of people, I think, who are able to make that work for them. Most gurus and like marketing kind of guys are going to tell you that you need to be a full-bore architect, that there's huge benefits to completely plotting out your story before you begin. And there are some huge benefits, and you need to be aware of them. The biggest benefit is whether your story is worth something before you begin writing a word on the page, which saves you a lot of time in the long run, because it's easier to revise your story before you write it than try to fix it after you've written it. So there's a truth to that. The other thing is that if you're trying to write a book that contains really specific elements, or is written for a really specific market, or is trying to produce a really specific effect, then you need to plan it out to a certain degree. You need to have an idea of how you're going to plan to put those things into context to have them work. And I know some people are going to be like, writing a book for a specific market, that sounds like heresy, but a lot of authors do that. And in my opinion, I think you're doing everyone, including yourself, a disservice if you're not writing with an audience in mind. You have to think about what other people are going to view your story with, their lenses rather than just your own. Otherwise, it's just an ego exercise, and maybe that's something you want to do, but I kind of think that it's cool for other people to read your stories and understand them and get something out of them. So I think you do need to be aware of the audience. So if you're having trouble as like a gardener, and most people kind of start off as gardeners and then become architects later as they gain experience and sort of learn the essential elements that they feel like they need to have to write a good story. If you're like a gardener, and especially if you're kind of new at this, and you find that you're having difficulty finishing a book or finishing a story in whatever medium you're working in, then it's probably good to look at what these architect writers are doing. Look at, some of the plot wheels that some people use to sort of figure out their big plot events in what order and what purpose each plot event is sort of serving. Look at those and see if those can be applied to your story, so that at least you have a bigger idea of what the house is going to look like, rather than hoping that it sort of grows into the shape that you want. So most people, like I said, they kind of start off as pantsers, they kind of start off as gardeners, and they develop more architecture stuff as they go, because you start to, with a lot of experience, you start to understand what kind of stuff you want to have in a story before you even begin writing it. The other question is, people are going to ask, well, which one are you? Well, I am more of an architect than I am a gardener, but I am not. I have found out I do much less planning than most other authors I know who consider themselves like architects or plotters, that consider themselves really good planners of story. I do a lot less planning. The way that I tend to write a story is I have an idea in my head of a story, and I think about, the conflict and the resolution, like what's the big thing that happens and how am I going to resolve that? Then I have like just a sequence of big events that I write down. So this happens, 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 and then finally that happens at the end. That's how I begin writing it. And it's literally just one line. It'll be something that's like, Helga goes here, Helga does this, Helga meets this person who doesn't want this, Helga does, so I'll have all those written down, and then I just begin writing the story. And I don't have, like I said, some people will plan down to like the scene. They'll go like, chapter 2, scene 2, here's what happens. And they have like a little synopsis of the plot event that's happening there. I don't like to do that. I'm kind of a jazz musician at heart. I'm certainly raised like playing jazz, and I'm an improviser at heart. And so if I don't have a little bit of leeway to work with in the moment of what I'm writing, then it tends to be a pretty miserable experience for me. And I will just tell you that for me, if I have things planned out too precisely, then I don't feel like I can properly adjust the story as I go, and I don't feel like I can add in some of the little touches that I think are necessary to give a story a lot of life. That's for my writing style. Experiences may vary. If you're somebody who really plans stuff out ahead of time and you feel like your stories are too dry or too cliche, you could try not planning out your scenes and try writing something like a scene by the seat of your pants. I tend to write, I don't even have listed how many scenes I'm going to have or what scenes are what. Some people think in terms of scenes like screenplay writers. I write screenplays and I don't even think of the scenes in the screenplay. I just think, well, I need to have this happen now. I guess, is this a new scene or do I have it in this scene? I have no thought for like how many scenes or what order they go in. I just think about what order things need to happen in, and I fill in any gaps that need to happen along the way. That also gives me a lot of room to write really dialogue that I think is very good for characters to talk about, that sort of exposes their character a lot more. If you have everything kind of planned down to the T, including like the characterization, that characterization can feel awkward or timed poorly. To me, I feel like if I fill it out a little bit more, then I can make better decisions about that. So I consider myself more of an architect than a gardener, but compared to other people, I'm like not planning anything. Things just come out, you know. But, you know, you got to find a little bit of a balance there. Like I said, George R. R. Martin's kind of a little more on the gardener side. I think he does quite a bit less planning than I do. Another famous one who does very little planning is Stephen King. Stephen King tends to just have ideas and then begin writing the book. He doesn't do a whole lot of this planning. So he's more on the gardener kind of side. Authors that tend to do a lot of planning ahead of time would be someone like Dan Brown, who I believe does a lot of planning ahead of time, and J.K. Rowling, who does an immense amount of planning for a book ahead of time, if I remember correctly. It's rather difficult to write something like the Harry Potter books without planning them ahead of time, or just to write mystery, because the Harry Potter books are actually kind of mystery plots put into a fantasy setting. That's kind of why I think people find them compelling and interesting. But to write a good mystery where you're putting in the clues before you arrive at the solution, you have to kind of plan those things out ahead of time. So she's probably more of a plotter than a pantser. And so you have to kind of think about, what kind of story am I writing? Am I writing something that's really personal, where having a heavy regulated plot will get in the way, and maybe do a little bit more gardening. If you're doing something that requires a lot of intricate plot work in order for the resolution to happen, you really need to be planning things out ahead of time. And in the future, I'll probably make some videos for, some things like plot wheels, some ways that if you're not used to sort of planning plots out, you can have like a basic tool to help you figure out like what events might go where. The other thing that I would probably say about myself in terms of liking to garden as I'm writing prose is that gives me what I feel like a lot more control over the pacing. And there's different kinds of pacing, right? There's pacing of big events, and then there's like the micro pacing. And if you read Muramasa Blood Drinker, which is one of my books, which is takes place in a feudal Japanese setting, one of the things I tried very hard to do with that book, and I did a lot of things to make sure this happened, is I tried to make sure that the pacing was good on the macro level as well as the micro level. So in the micro level there, I'm trying to have an event happen every page or two, usually every 2 pages. Every 2 pages, something significant happens to make the plot continue going forward. And I did that kind of specifically, but in order for me to achieve that, I couldn't plan out ahead of time. Well, on this page, I'm going to have this happen. On this page, I'm going to have this happen. I'm writing the scene, and I know sort of the next thing that needs to happen, and I'm going to fill in the dots. I'm going to make sure that I get this done in 2 pages and this other part done in 2 pages, or I'm going to have put a reveal here that keeps people reading. So then you have what's called a page turner. People talk about, oh, this book's such a page turner. It just means that like the events are happening quick enough, and there's enough tension being introduced into the story constantly that you feel like you just want to keep turning the page to get that tension resolution thing happening over and over again. So I feel like if I'm gardening more on the micro level, I'm able to control the pacing better. I'm able to feel out how quickly a scene's going and when I need to have another little plot event happen. So anyway, I hope that has been useful for you. And please leave me your comments down below and let me know what you like and what you think and what you want to see in the future. I'm always appreciative of the comments. I do read them, even if I don't respond to every single one. I try to read all of them. And I do appreciate you watching. If you're watching on VidMe, leave me a comment. And if you're watching on BitChute, leave me a comment as well. I'll have a video about that maybe in the future here. So you guys have a great one. I'll see you next time.